right, guys, this should be a relatively quick set of notes going over Chapter 11. Chapter 11 deals with biodiversity and conservation biology, and the little example they give you at the start of Chapter 11 is about the Siberian tiger. So on this slide, I want you to write your notes about this real-world example again, so you could use it on essay questions and responses. The Siberian tiger is kind of the classic story of biodiversity loss. It's what we think of when we think of extinction of animals. It really just happened that poaching and hunting of this tiger got out of control to the point where there was very few of the tigers left in the wild. And what has had to happen is the government has had to step in and put in new laws and regulations against the poaching and the hunting, and they had to help these tigers. They had to reintroduce some of these tigers into the wild from zoos, and all in all, it's been a success story, and the number of tigers has increased. So make yourself a note here of that example, just that classic example of the biodiversity loss. Let's put some definitions to these terms. Let's start off with a definition for biodiversity. Okay, so let's define this term. Come on, pointer. There we go. Biodiversity is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization. The variety of life across all levels of biological organization. The variety of life across all levels of biological organization. And you learned those levels in biology class. We reviewed them in one of our initial chapters. You know, you're looking at organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and the entire biosphere. So we're looking at the variety of life across all of those levels. The easiest way to measure biodiversity is to look at species diversity. Species diversity is looking at the number of or variety of species in a region. Okay, let me give you that definition one more time. Looking at the number of or the variety of species in a region. And we've done this already this year. We've measured species richness and species evenness. Remember, you might want to write down the definitions here, that richness is the number of species. So an ecosystem that's very rich has many, many different types of species. And evenness measures the abundance of the different species. So we looked at some examples in that car lab that we did. Populations or ecosystems that both had 10 different species. They were equal in richness. But in one population, I had 10 of each of the different types of species for 100 total organisms. And in the other population, I had 90 of one organism and only one of each of the rest. So not as even. So when we look at the diversity, we look at the richness and the evenness to figure out how diverse the ecosystem really is, or how diverse the species really is. Species diversity is influenced by two things. Okay, two simple things that you already know. Okay, let's write these down. It's influenced by speciation and extinction. These are terms you already learned this year. So speciation is when organisms evolve and you get new species. Okay, and extinction is when species are disappear. So the diversity of a species is going to be influenced by how quickly is that species evolving into new species, how quickly is it changing into new things, and how quickly is it disappearing from the planet. And as you probably could guess, species diversity is influenced the most, it's put under the most pressure by human consumption. Humans are putting a lot of pressure on the plants and on the animals of the planet and influencing the species diversity. Okay, but back to the list we have here. Biodiversity is a variety of life across all levels of biological organization. So it's not just at the species level, it's also at the genetic level and at the ecosystem level. These are the three most common levels that a scientist would work at. Let's talk about what we mean by genetic diversity. So taxonomists are scientists that go out and classify organisms, and they classify things into kingdoms and phylums and families and species, but they actually can classify things all the way down into what are called subspecies. Okay, so taxonomists can classify organisms all the way down into subspecies. Oops. We can look at very small differences between organisms. So, for example, a tiger is a species, but there's actually 5 subspecies of tiger on the planet. So they're all tigers and they're closely related. We can look all the way down to differences in the DNA among individuals, and that's what we look at with genetic diversity. Genetic diversity studies how different is the DNA among individuals in a population. How different is the DNA among individuals in a population? And we want the genetic diversity to be high, because the higher the genetic diversity, the more chance of survival for the species. They're going to be able to survive impacts and changes because there's a better chance of a gene being in the population that will allow for the survival. So genetic diversity is really going down to the very small scale of biological organization, looking at DNA. Ecosystem diversity is going up to the large scale. Ecosystem diversity is studying the number of ecosystems in an area, the number of habitats, the patches in an area. So you can study this variety of life at any one of these biological levels of organization. Now, how do we measure biodiversity? It's really hard to do. And the reason why it's hard to do, I've listed some of the reasons there for you. First off, some species are just really, really small. And some organisms are just really hard to identify. It's hard to tell what you're looking at. And some areas of the earth are really hard to explore. This picture over here, you may be wondering what this is a picture of. This is an example I wanted to give you that just proves all 3 of those things. This is a very small species that was very hard to identify and very hard to get to. This is a small species of a worm-like creature that was just discovered over the summer at the bottom of the ocean. And what you're seeing there is these little worms attached to the bones of a whale. These species are very small. They're about 1 millimeter long. They're very hard to identify. It turns out that what you're looking at, those red worm-like structures, those are the females. The males of the species actually live inside the female their entire lives, so it took a very long time for scientists to figure out what they were even looking at. And it was very hard to get down to the depths of the ocean where these species live. So to actually calculate the biodiversity on the planet has not been an easy thing to do. Right now, when we measure biodiversity, we estimate that there's about 1.8 million species. So go ahead and write that down. That's a number I want you to know. We estimate there's about 1.8 million species. But are we done counting everything? Absolutely not. Is this an area where we're finished? No. Scientists are still constantly discovering new species. The other reason why we have to keep looking at biodiversity is because it's not evenly distributed. So looking at the picture, looking at the pie chart at the top of the page, this is just a rough little graph showing you the distribution of life into the different kingdoms, the different categories that exist. And if you look, the majority of life on this planet are actually insects. So all this part of the pie are all insect species. So most things on this planet, the largest majority of life on this planet are insects. And of the insects, beetles take up the largest part of that group. So that's something you probably want to know, that if we look at all living things on the planet, insects do dominate in terms of numbers or percentages, and beetles are largest within that group. So life is not evenly distributed. There's also what we call latitudinal gradients, and we've talked about this a little bit when we were talking about our biomes. The idea that if we take the globe and we separate out the latitude lines, we find much more life near the equator than we do near the poles. So write yourself a definition there in your own words. The idea that we find more life towards the equator than the poles. As we go farther and farther away from the equator, we get less and less diversity. There's a lot of debate on why this is. It's mostly assumed it's due to the stability of the climates in those areas. But even within habitats, habitats can be very diverse. You know, going from one grassland to another, we find different types of habitats, and we call those ecotones. So there's lots of ways to study biodiversity, and it's hard to do. In our study of biodiversity, we do have to talk about extinction because, of course, what we're worried about is a loss of our biodiversity. Let's start off by making sure we know the basic terms. There is a difference between the terms extinction and extirpation. And actually, what we're most of the time talking about is extirpation. Extinction is the loss of every single one, every last one of a species. Extirpation is loss of a species in one area. So what's actually going on with those tigers in Siberia is extirpation, not extinction. We talked about extinction a little bit in one of our earlier chapters, but just as a review, there is a natural rate of extinction that has nothing to do with humans, and we call that the background rate of extinction. Okay, this has nothing to do with humans. It's not caused by humans. It's not caused by any major catastrophic events. It's just a natural rate that we found that organisms in general do just sometimes go extinct. And it's a slow, natural process. Okay, it's estimated, and what you want to know, if you don't already have this memorized, write it down, that of all the things that have ever lived on the planet, 99% of them are extinct at this point. So only 1% of all the things that ever lived on this planet are still here. So let's do that natural background rate of extinction. But what we've also talked about as a quick review is that there are mass extinction events. Mass extinction events are very sudden, very quick, major events where we see a big drop in biodiversity. If you look at the graph here, you can see some of these mass extinction events labeled, that just sudden, quick drops in the number of species. Scientists estimate, it's estimated that we are currently in a sixth mass extinction event that started between 15 and 30,000 years ago. So a lot of times when people discuss this sixth mass extinction event that's going on right now, they really attribute it to modern human activities. But we have to remember that this sixth mass extinction event is not just from modern activities. It's from all human activities. And this is about the time, the date is estimated, what you want to write down, is this is about the time that people really were hunting and gathering and starting their farming and really moving around the planet, getting into North America, getting into South America. One example of this extinction, the sixth mass extinction, quick event that was caused by humans, when Polynesians finally made it to the Hawaiian Islands, very quickly, within just a few years, they killed off about half of the bird species. Now, this happened tens of thousands of years ago, but we know from the fossil record that about half of the bird species just